Fleet Intelligence Officer Draven did not look up from his console. Sovereign, we have run the analysis on every vessel in the human formation. There is no elevated communication signature. There is no protected positioning. There is no vessel that the others are orienting toward or deferring to. We have tried every model we have. Try the ones we don't have. Draven's hands moved across his console. He was 26 years old, 3 years into his first deep space posting, and he had the particular posture of someone who has just understood something that he would very much have preferred not to understand. His shoulders were tight. His breath was controlled. He was doing the thing that well-trained people do when the information they are holding is too large for the moment. He was working, because working was the only available response. Corran watched him for 4 seconds. Then Corran walked to the tactical display at the center of his bridge and looked at the human fleet himself. They were arrayed across the Varith system in a formation that his 6 centuries of accumulated military reference could not name, not because it was complex. It was, in some ways, almost simple. But simplicity in military formation meant vulnerability, because a simple formation had predictable gaps, predictable weaknesses, predictable responses to specific pressure. This formation had none of those things, because it was not a formation in the doctrinal sense. It was a distribution. Every vessel holding a position that maximized its individual field of fire while simultaneously covering the position of every other vessel. No hierarchy. No clustering around a protected core. A web with no center. Cut any thread and the web holds. The surrounding threads redistribute. The hole closes. Corran's exoskeletal plating had gone fully black across his jaw. All vessels, he said to the fleet-wide channel, identify human command structure and focus fire, priority target. The responses came back within 90 seconds. 14 captains, 14 reports, all of them saying in their various ways the same thing Draven had said. There was no command structure to target because the command structure was the entire fleet, which meant the command structure was nowhere in particular, which meant the doctrine that had served the Volkai Dominion for 6 centuries had just encountered, for the first time, something it did not have a box for. In the sealed archive vaults of Nexus D-Her, Archivist Peleth Awan was reading the intercept feed. She had access to the live military communications through her archival clearance, not in real time, but on a delay of approximately 4 minutes, which was the processing time for the translation and classification systems that sat between the raw signal and the vault's terminals. 4 minutes was, it turned out, exactly enough time to know what was happening without being able to do anything about it. Awan had found, over 61 years, that this was a reasonably accurate description of the archival profession in general. She watched Corran's fleet deploy. She watched the human formation hold. She watched the first round of Volkai targeting attempts return null results, and the second round, and the third. Her dorsal nodes pulsed amber, then gold, then settled into a slow amber rhythm that she recognized as her body's response to confirmed pattern recognition, the biological equivalent of a door clicking shut on something she had already known was there. Subarchivist Menot appeared at the vault entrance, hesitating in the way that junior archivists hesitated when they had information they weren't sure how to deliver. Archivist Awan, Menot's voice was careful. The Council Communications Office is asking whether we should begin preparing the standard post-conflict documentation package. Awan did not look up from the intercept feed. Begin preparing it. Should I use the standard template? Use the one in the restricted folder, 3rd shelf, the one that has the second date field already formatted. Menot was quiet for a moment, then she went to the 3rd shelf. 40 hours after the quiet protocols activated, Sovereign Dreveth Corran issued the order for full fleet engagement. He did it standing, which was the Volkai custom for significant commands. His primary arms were extended, the formal posture of sovereign authority. The The ritual tattoo on his left collarbone was fully visible, 51 entries, each one a species that had met this moment and chosen differently than humanity was choosing. He had displayed it again deliberately. Awan noted this in her record later, with the specific notation that she was uncertain whether it had been a conscious decision. The Volkai fleet moved. What happened in the next 3 hours and 11 minutes would eventually be studied in military academies across 14 galactic powers. Awan accessed the full engagement record 6 weeks after the battle and reviewed it across 3 separate sessions, because the full record was long, and she found that she needed breaks, not from the violence. She had reviewed violent footage before, but from the particular quality of watching a very capable military force apply everything it had learned, correctly and professionally, against an opponent for whom those lessons were simply not the relevant variable. The Volkai were good. That was the thing that Awan kept returning to in her notes in her private record. They were genuinely good. Their formations were precise. Their captains made sound decisions under pressure. Their weapons technology was among the finest in the current galactic order. In any engagement against any of the 51 species in Korran's tattoo, they would have won. In an engagement against the species they had believed humanity to be, the thin-file species, single system, no military record, they would have won in hours. The problem was not their quality. The problem was the axiom. Primitive, negligible, standard protocol. The axiom was wrong, and because it was wrong, every correct decision built on top of it was wrong in the specific way that a structurally sound building is wrong when it is built on a foundation that cannot hold the weight. The Volkai captains made sound tactical decisions in response to the opponents they had been briefed to expect. The opponents that actually showed up were different. And the gap between those two things, between the briefed enemy and the actual enemy, was the space in which the battle was lost before the first shot was fired. Terevith was 29 years old. He was a junior tactical officer aboard the Volkai destroyer Relentless Mandate, 3 years into his first deep space posting. He had received his conquest count tattoo 3 weeks before the fleet departed for the Vareth system, 1 entry, his first, the small species they had absorbed in the Outer Rim 6 months prior. He had been proud of it. He had shown it to his bunkmate, to his senior officer, to his mother on the communication screen before they left port. He had arranged his uniform collar to show it at formal occasions, the way Sovereign Korran arranged his. 3 hours into the engagement, the Relentless Mandate's weapons officer reported that 40% of their targeting solutions were returning errors. Not misses, errors. The human vessels they were assigned to engage were moving in patterns that the Mandate's targeting computer had no predictive model for, because the patterns were not patterns in the doctrinal sense. They were improvisations, real-time adaptations, each vessel choosing its next movement based on information the Volkai fleet did not know the humans had. Terevith ran his panel's secondary analysis. The human ships near his position had, in the last 90 minutes, changed their individual approach vectors 11 times each. Not randomly. Each change had been a direct response to Volkai fire, implemented faster than any centralized command structure could have authorized, which meant the authorization was not coming from outside the vessel, which meant each human crew was making these decisions independently, in real time, based on what they were observing, which meant the human fleet was learning, not as a fleet, but as 400 simultaneous individual units, each one conducting its own version of the analysis that Admiral Rodriguez had broadcast 12 hours into the Vejhari engagement 2 centuries ago. Terevith looked at the tattoo on his forearm. The ink was still slightly raised. He had not expected, when he had it done, that the number would feel different 3 weeks later. He had not expected the number to mean something other than what it had meant when he chose it. He returned to his panel and kept working, because there was nothing else to do, and because he was, whatever else was happening, a professional. The energy wave crested at the 2-hour mark and did not come down. Awan watched the intercept feed with the specific attention she reserved for confirmation events, the moments when a pattern she had identified in historical record repeated itself in live data. The Vejhari engagement had a 2-hour mark too, she recalled. So had the second species. In all three historical cases, the 2-hour mark was the point at which the attacking forces' command communications changed register. Before 2 hours, confident, tactical, directional. After 2 hours, requesting, reporting, and eventually describing. Koran's fleet communications shifted at 2 hours and 4 minutes. The first captain to use the word unexplained in a tactical report was the commanding officer of a carrier group on the system's northern approach vector. She used it to describe the weapon that had just disabled her forward shield array, a directed energy system that her analysis team identified as partially derived from Vejhari technology, partially from something with no catalog entry, and partially, her report noted with visible confusion, from what appeared to be heavily modified asteroid mining equipment. 4 minutes later, a second captain used unexplained. Then a third. Awan noted the time and wrote 2 hours 11 minutes, language shift confirmed, third iteration of pattern, deviation from historical timeline, 7 minutes faster than the Vejhari case, 14 minutes faster than the second case. She paused over the notation. Then she added, acceleration may indicate refinement. She did not know what that meant for the future. She noted it anyway. In the Varath system, Fleet Admiral Saren Nal stood at the center of Solar Defense Station, Kale 9 Tactical Operations Room, and watched the engagement display. She had been standing for 2 hours and 30 minutes. She had declined the chair her XO had offered 4 times. Standing was not, for Nal, a symbolic gesture. It was practical. She thought better standing, and this was a moment that required thought, even though the engagement itself was proceeding according to the parameters her captains had been authorized to act within. There was very little for her to do. That was the point. Before she had opened the fleet-wide channel, before the countdown, before the engagement began, she had done something that Lieutenant Commander Vesh had been present for and had not spoken about since. Nal had rolled her left sleeve up. Not all the way, just to the midpoint of her forearm so the burn scar was visible. She had looked at it for approximately 3 seconds. Vesh had seen her do this and had understood in the way that people understand things they are not told directly that this was not a habitual gesture. It was a specific one. Something was being remembered. Something was being carried into the next few hours deliberately as a passenger. Then Nal had straightened her sleeve and opened the channel. This is Fleet Admiral Nal to all vessels in the Varath system. Formal countdown begins now. Her voice was even, not cold. Even, which is a different thing, the register of someone who has considered this exact moment for a very long time and has arrived at it without surprise. 30. She counted every number, same pace, same pitch. Vesh had told Awan weeks later in a debrief that Awan was technically not authorized to attend but had arranged to listen to from an adjacent room. She counted all 30. I kept expecting her to pause. She didn't pause. She sounded like she was reading coordinates. 3, 2, 1. The human fleet opened fire. What happened in the next hour was, in Awan's assessment after extensive review, not a battle in the way that word is typically applied. A battle implies two forces engaging each other in a way that produces a genuinely contested outcome. What the engagement records showed when Awan reviewed them was something closer to the moment when a lock encounters the key it was designed for. Not struggle, exactly. Correspondence. Each human tactical decision keyed precisely to a vulnerability that the Volcae formation had, not because the humans had studied the Volcae specifically, but because they had studied enough things to know where military formations in general were fragile, and Volcae formations were not exempt from the general case. The Volkai fought well. Awan noted this repeatedly in her record because she thought it was important. They did not break or scatter or abandon doctrine. They applied their considerable skill and training to the problem in front of them with full professionalism, and the problem in front of them was simply beyond the reach of what their doctrine had been designed to solve. The carrier groups folded first, their centralized command structures making them the most vulnerable to the human fleet's distributed targeting. Without carrier coordination, the escort vessels lost their tactical framework. Without escort coverage, the capital ships were isolated. The Volkai had been trained to fight as an integrated system, every component supporting every other component. The human fleet did not attack the ships. It attacked the connections between them, and the connections came apart, and the ships became individual units rather than a fleet, and individual units were much easier to handle. At 2 hours and 50 minutes, Koran ordered all ships to focus fire on the human command vessel. 14 captains reported, within 90 seconds, that they could not identify one. At 3 hours and 7 minutes, Koran's own bridge weapons went offline. At 3 hours and 11 minutes, the last Volkai capital ship still broadcasting on the fleet channel fell silent. The display was still on. Awan knew this from the sensor record, which she reviewed 3 days after the engagement. She had not been watching in real time. The intercept delay meant she had been 4 minutes behind throughout, and by the time she saw the end of the engagement feed, the outcome had already been filed in her records under the category she had chosen when Menot almost filed the declaration under ceremonial announcements. But she reviewed the sensor footage of the Sovereign's Reach Bridge because it was part of the complete record, and complete records were what she did. She watched Koran standing at the center of his bridge. The tactical display was still on. She understood why he hadn't turned it off. She had seen that specific reason twice before in historical footage. The way a being keeps a display active past the point of usefulness, because the display is the last object in the room that is behaving predictably. Everything else has changed. The display is just updating. Updating is something it has always done. Letting it continue is a way of holding on to the frame of a world that has stopped being accurate. The display updated, another gray indicator. Then another. Koran straightened his primary arms, the formal posture of sovereign authority, the posture he used when addressing subordinates. A reflex of rank, installed over decades of command, activating before his mind had consciously decided to address anyone. He called for his fleet intelligence officer. He asked for a damage report. The silence that followed was, Awan wrote in her notes, not the silence of a broken channel. She had reviewed the audio record. The channel was live. Draven was present. His breathing was audible, slow and controlled, the breathing of someone applying significant effort to a routine function. He did not answer because the answer, delivered accurately, would have required him to describe the complete elimination of the Volkai Dominion's military capacity in a single engagement, and he did not have language for that yet. None of them did. It was new language. It would take time to develop. Nal's voice entered the channel without announcement. No static, no delay indicator. Just there, the way it had been 11 seconds after Koran's ultimatum, present rather than arriving, as if it had been waiting in the channel all along. Sovereign Koran, the same register, not cold, even. Your crew will not be harmed. Your fleet has been disarmed. Your empire's military capacity will not be restored. Please prepare for boarding. A pause, one breath. The audio record captured it clearly. I am sorry it came to this, I mean that. Awan watched Koran's face in the sensor footage. His exoskeletal plating was the color with no good name, between black and bruised purple, the color it had gone when he had first understood, on the tactical display, that his model was wrong. His horizontal pupils had widened past the point that any behavioral index in the Volkai's own literature had documented. His primary arms, still extended in the formal posture he had reflexed into, lowered slowly. not a collapse, a setting down. He believed her. Awan could see it happen. The specific moment, a slight change in the angle of his jaw, a stillness in his shoulders that was different from the stillness of command when he processed the 4 sentences and understood that they were accurate. She was not negotiating. She was not performing. The crew would not be harmed. The fleet had been disarmed. The military capacity would not be restored. She was sorry. She meant it. The worst part, Awan had always thought, about this specific outcome, the outcome that recurred across the files in her category, was not the defeat. Defeat could be contextualized, rationalized, filed under circumstances and probabilities, and the particular bad luck of a specific engagement. What could not be rationalized was mercy delivered in exactly the same voice as the warning. The species that had warned you and the species that was now dictating your terms was the same species. The voice had not changed temperature between the two moments, which meant the warning had been genuine, which meant you had been given a real choice, which meant what had happened was not something done to you, but something you had chosen by choosing not to hear the warning. That was the thing that broke the model completely. The Volkai tactical projection had assigned humanity a 94% probability of surrender within 40 hours. The engagement had lasted 3 hours and 11 minutes. The 6% margin had, it turned out, been generous. Within 6 hours of the engagement's end, Awan noted in her record, the Corvexy Dominion had transmitted encrypted queries to 3 separate galactic intelligence brokers. The queries asked for current human fleet composition data, specifically, the number of active vessels, their distribution across the Varith system, and whether the deep cartography fleet had returned to standard patrol routes or remained in home system orbit. The brokers had no useful answers. Nobody did. The data simply wasn't available in the way the Corvexy were expecting data to be available, because the humans had not published it. And the humans had not published it because publishing your military capacity was something you did when you wanted to deter conflict. And humanity had apparently concluded some time ago that the species most likely to start a conflict were precisely the species least likely to be deterred by published numbers. Awan filed the Corvexy query, intercept under the category she had created. She left the second date field blank. 6 months after the Battle of the Varith system, the fields of Dissavar Minor were in early harvest. The planet had been a Volkai administrative center once, a mid-tier posting, mostly bureaucratic, populated by officials and their families and the support infrastructure that administrative centers require. After the engagement, the Human Settlement Authority had assessed it and designated it for agricultural conversion, which was the standard outcome for Volkai administrative worlds. The soil was good. The climate was stable. The former administrative population had, with varying degrees of resistance and eventual acceptance, become farmers. It was, by the metrics that the Human Settlement Authority applied, a successful transition. Sovereign Dreveth Koran, former sovereign, the settlement authority's records were careful about the word, was working the eastern field on a Tuesday morning when Administrator Rithia Vaughn came to find him. He was operating a harvesting rig, a mid-sized piece of equipment designed for the modified grain variety that grew well in Dissavar Minor's particular soil. He had learned to operate it 6 weeks ago, in a training session with 7 other former Volkai officials, and he had been competent at it from the second day, because he was, whatever else had changed, someone who had spent 6 centuries learning to manage complex systems. A harvesting rig was a simpler system than a war fleet. The transition was not as large as it looked from the outside. His exoskeletal plating had faded. The amber to black range of his reactive pigmentation required a specific hormonal register to maintain, and that register was connected, in Volkai biology, to active command state. Without command, the pigmentation defaulted. The current color was a dusty, pale tan, the color of Volkai who had been in retirement for many years, or who had never held command at all. It made him look, Vaughn had thought the first time she met him, like a very large, very tired person who had been standing in indirect light for too long. The ritual tattoo on his left collarbone was covered by his work collar. The collar was standard-issue settlement authority material, moderately warm, the kind of garment designed to be functional rather than comfortable, but which had settled into something tolerable over repeated wearing. The field mornings on Dissavar Minor were cold. He had not removed the collar since the first week. Vaughn walked the harvest rows alongside him for a while without speaking. This was her habit when she visited the field teams. She had found that walking beside people, rather than approaching them with a purpose already announced, produced more honest conversation. "The harvest numbers look good this season," she said finally. "Your team is ahead of the projection." Corin did not stop the rig. He adjusted a setting on the intake panel with the ease of someone who had been doing it for weeks. "The soil here is better than the reports suggested. There's a mineral content in the eastern section that the modified grain responds to particularly well. I've documented it for the agricultural office." I saw the report. It was thorough. It seemed worth documenting accurately. He paused the rig at the end of a row to let the collection bin cycle. "Accurate documentation is useful. I've found that to be true in several different kinds of work." Vaughn looked at him. The bin cycled. He started the rig again. "How are you adapting?" she asked. "Not the work, you." The rig moved along the next row. Between them, the modified grain fell in steady intervals, the intake mechanism quiet and rhythmic. "I spent 6 centuries learning to take things apart," Corin said. He did not look at her. His eyes were on the row ahead. "It turns out the reverse is harder." Vaughn nodded. "Most things worth doing are." They walked the rest of the row in silence. 3 months after the Dissavar Minor harvest, the Corvexy Dominion announced its intention to conduct what it described as a capability assessment of a human research outpost near the boundary of contested space. The announcement was transmitted through official channels. It was framed as a routine territorial verification, the kind of administrative action that mid-tier expansionist powers conducted periodically when they wanted to test the edges of what was tolerated without committing to a declaration. The framing was careful. The phrasing was measured. The Corvexy had clearly thought about how to phrase it. In the convocation spire, the announcement was received in a session that Awan attended from the archivist's gallery. The wall color shifted toward the shade that the spire's chromatic record called anticipatory grief. It had been displaying that color more frequently lately. The material that made up the spire was very old. Awan sometimes thought it had learned to recognize this specific combination of species and decision pattern the way a body learns to recognize the early signs of a recurring condition. The council's response was procedural. The announcement was logged. Questions were raised. Answers were given that satisfied the procedural requirements without resolving the underlying situation. The session ended. Afterward, quietly, without announcement, without a council resolution or a public statement, the Humanitarian Infrastructure Office began preparing a logistics package for Corvexy civilian populations. Medical supplies, agricultural equipment, settlement authority contacts in 3 nearby systems with available agricultural land. The standard package, updated to reflect current population estimates. The office had a template for it. They used the template regularly. Nobody mentioned this publicly. It was simply done, the way experienced people prepare for weather. Awan returned to the vaults. She settled into the archive chair and adjusted the holographic display angle, the same calibration, the same motion, logged in her access record for 61 years, automatic as breathing. She opened a new file. She entered the species name. She entered the date. She left the second date blank. Then she reached across the table for the sealed chip. It was warm. She held it for 11 seconds, the way she always held new objects, letting her memory nodes complete their indexing cycle. The nodes pulsed amber along her dorsal ridge, then gold, then settled. Whatever the chip was running, it had been running it for longer than the current filing system had existed, longer than the Council's current charter, longer than most of the species currently represented in the spire above her had been in contact with galactic civilization. She set it down. She closed the new file and placed it on the shelf, third shelf, restricted access, beside the others in the category that Minot had almost misfiled. She aligned its edge with the edge of the file beside it. The file beside it had 2 dates. The gap between the first date and the second was very small. Alan turned off the display. The vault was quiet. The cold held in the walls the way old stone holds cold, deep and patient. Somewhere above her, 9 levels up, the convocation spire's walls were shifting through colors that had names in the chromatic record and meanings that anyone who had worked in the vaults long enough could read without looking them up. The chip sat on the table in the dark. Warm. It had always been warm. It had always been running. The display was still on. That was the first wrong thing. Every other system on the bridge of the Sovereign's Reach had gone dark in the last 11 minutes. Navigation, weapons, the sublight drives that had carried 440 capital ships across 600 years of unbroken victory. All of it quiet now, the way a body goes quiet when something fundamental stops. But the tactical display at the center of the bridge still ran, still updated, still pulled sensor data from a debris field that stretched, in every direction, as far as the display could render. Sovereign Dreveth Koran stood at the center of his bridge and did not move. He was 9 feet tall. His exoskeletal plating, which had been amber when he dressed that morning, had gone a color that had no good name, not quite black, not quite the deep bruise purple that Volkai commanders sometimes turned under extreme cold. Something between them, something new. His 4 arms hung at his sides, the primary 2 open-palmed, the vestigial 2 folded against his ribcage the way they always folded when he was thinking carefully. His horizontal pupils had widened to nearly round. In 6 centuries of Volkai military record, no behavioral index existed for what that particular dilation meant, because no Volkai commander had ever needed to express it before. The display updated again. Another ship gone gray. They had been going gray for 3 hours and 11 minutes. Not all at once. That would have been easier to process. They went gray in clusters, in surgical sequences, in patterns that Koran's tactical mind kept trying to classify and kept failing. Not a sustained barrage. Not an overwhelming wave of numbers. Something more like a series of precise, unhurried decisions, each one completed before the next one began, each one irreversible. He still had his bridge. He still had his life. The specific quality of those 2 facts, their deliberateness, their selectiveness, had settled into the back of his chest somewhere around the 2-hour mark and had not moved since. Fleet intelligence. His voice came out smaller than he meant it to. A sound from across the bridge, not words, a presence confirming it was still there. Damage report. Silence. Not a broken channel, not a system failure. The silence of a person sitting at a functioning console, looking at numbers that were accurate, understanding that delivering them accurately would require inventing a new language on the spot, and deciding that silence was the more honest response. The communication system activated without announcement. No static, no delay, just present the way a voice is present when it has been waiting rather than traveling. Sovereign Koran. The voice was even, not cold even, which is a different thing. Your crew will not be harmed. Your fleet has been disarmed. Your empire's military capacity will not be restored. Please prepare for boarding. A pause, 1 breath's worth. I am sorry it came to this, I mean that. Koran stared at the display. He believed her. That was the worst part. Across 3 hours and 11 minutes of engagement, he had watched his fleet, 6 centuries of refinement, the finest military instrument the Volkai Dominion had ever assembled, become debris. and the voice that delivered his terms now spoke with exactly the same temperature it had used to give him a warning 41 hours ago. She had not wanted this. She had been precise about that. He was only now understanding that precision had been its own kind of mercy. The part that matters isn't the battle, it's what they found in the files afterward. Stay close. 41 hours earlier, the chip was cold on the table. Or rather, it was warm. It was always warm. In the sealed archive vaults of Nexus D-Her, where the ambient temperature held at 4 degrees above freezing year-round to preserve the holographic substrate, everything was cold. Archivist Peleth Awan's exhalation fogged faintly as she moved between the storage arrays. The mineral walls of the vault compressed neutron star material, the same material that formed the convocation spire 9 levels above, held the cold the way old stone holds it, deep and patient. The chip was warm. Awan had held it for 11 seconds before setting it on the table. 11 seconds because that was how long her memory nodes needed to complete a full indexing cycle on a new object. The nodes ran along her dorsal ridge, bioluminescent, amber gold when active. They had pulsed steadily during the 11 seconds. Then they had gone still. The chip was matte black, roughly the size of a Quilhari thumb joint. No visible ports, no markings, no obvious interface. Whatever it was running internally, on power it had apparently always had, drawing from something that was not a standard energy source and had not been one for as long as the vault's records showed. The entry log for the chip predated the current filing system. It predated the filing system before that. Awan set it on the table and picked up her work. Subarchivist Menot was already at the far console, pulling files from the morning session upstairs. The Voakai declaration had come down through official channels 20 minutes after the session ended, a formal copy, sealed, addressed to the archival record. Menot held the file for a moment, her 4 small fingers hovering over the categorization field. Then she typed 2 letters, selected from the drop-down, and filed it. Awan glanced at the screen as she passed. She stopped. She reached across and corrected the category without a word. Menot saw where the file moved. She looked at the label Awan had chosen. She looked at the files already there, the other entries in that category, each labeled with a species name, each with a date, many with 2 dates, the gap between the first and the second very small. Menot did not speak again for the rest of the shift. Neither did Awan. She pulled up the historical record instead. The files on the Voakai Dominion were, from the outside, unremarkable. 437 confirmed conquests across 6 centuries, extensive military doctrine, detailed records of technological development. The Dominion was, by any measure, one of the most comprehensively documented empires in the current galactic order. The files on humanity were thin. Single system. No military engagements on record against galactic-tier opponents. No territorial claims. No weapons treaties because no weapons had ever been formally acknowledged. The profile of something that had chosen, very deliberately, not to be seen. Awan had worked in these vaults for 61 years. She had read the human file before. She pulled it up now not to learn anything new, but to do the thing she always did when a new species made this particular declaration. She set the 2 files side by side and looked at them together. Thick optimistic file, thin quiet file. She had done this 3 times before. The thick file always ended abruptly, usually around week 6 of whatever engagement the species had been so confident about. The thin file never ended. It just added a footnote. Every species currently under human protection had once been a military power. Not one of them had chosen agriculture. Agriculture had chosen them. Awan's dorsal nodes pulsed amber, then gold, then amber again. She began preparing the memorial archive template. She always got it ready early. It was easier that way. 9 levels above, the convocation spire was still processing what it had just witnessed. The spire was 4 kilometers of compressed neutron star mineral, needle-thin against the sky of Nexus D Her, its walls translucent enough to show the species inside the way a lantern shows a flame. The walls shifted color with the aggregate emotional register of the chamber, a design feature that had seemed whimsical when the spire was built, 12,000 years ago, and had since proved to be the most accurate political barometer in galactic history. Right now, the walls were a color that the spire's chromatic record designated as anticipatory grief. It had not displayed that color in 80 years. 947 species were represented in the chamber. Most of them had been there for the morning session. Most of them had heard Sovereign Drevath Koron of the Volkai Dominion stride to the declaration platform and announce, with the specific ceremonial confidence of something that had done this 51 times before, that the Varith system, including its third planet, inhabited by a species that called themselves humans, was now sovereign Volkai territory. Relocation of current inhabitants would begin within one standard cycle. The Dominion thanked the Council for its attention. The hall did not erupt. It did not protest, or demand, or raise procedural objections. Awan had been watching from the archivist's gallery, and she could describe what happened in the chamber with clinical precision. 947 species went quiet in the specific way that living things go quiet when they watch something step toward a fire, and have already calculated that nothing they say will stop it. Delegate Tharavan of the Drethali Federation began shifting color immediately. The Drethali were crystalline-skinned, their emotional register expressed entirely through spectral change, conversational blues and greens, stress in orange and red, fear in a deep translucent crimson that their bodies only produced under threat of imminent extinction. Tharavan was cycling through orange to orange so fast that the frequencies were producing a faint audible hum, almost below the threshold of hearing, like a glass rim touched with a wet finger. His aide put a hand on his arm, not to restrain him, just to let him know someone else could feel it too. Koron had not seemed to notice. He was, Awan had observed from above, exactly what the Volkai Dominion's dossier described. 9 feet of exoskeletal authority, his amber plating catching the spire's overhead light. He moved across the platform with the deliberate slowness of something that had genuinely never been outrun, every gesture calibrated for maximum formal weight. His primary arms gestured with practiced ease as he spoke. His left collarbone was visible above his formal collar. The ritual tattoo, Volkai script, 51 entries, each one representing a species that had encountered the Dominion's war fleet and ceased to exist as a military force afterward. He had displayed the tattoo deliberately. Awan had noted the angle of his collar. It was not accidental. The Volkai Dominion has conquered 43 species in the last standard century, Koron said, his translator rendering the words into 947 simultaneous languages through the chamber's communication arrays. We have war fleets that have never known defeat. We bring the Varith system into our empire not as an act of aggression, but as an act of natural order. Natural order. Awan had written that phrase into her session notes and underlined it once. The species in her category, the one where Menot had almost filed the Volkai Declaration, every single one of them had used a phrase like that. Some variation of natural order, inevitable expansion, the rights of the strong. It was, she had come to understand, not arrogance exactly. It was a failure of imagination so complete that it had calcified into philosophy. The council chair, Elder Vasrith of the Quilhari Senior Council, had responded with 3 sentences. The council acknowledged the declaration. The council would not interfere. The council would not support. This matter was between the Dominion and the inhabitants of the Varith system. Koron had looked faintly surprised. He had expected opposition, or alliance. Not this specific withdrawal, this careful stepping back, this universal and immediate removal of everyone else from the trajectory of what was coming. He had not understood what it meant. Awan had watched his pupils tracking the chamber as representatives began filing out, sending urgent communications, some of them already requesting emergency transport out of Voakai-adjacent space. He had smiled. She had seen it from the gallery. He had read the exodus as confirmation of his dominance. Awan had gone back to the vaults. She had work to do. The historical files were not pleasant viewing. They never were. But they were necessary in the way that a physician's records of a recurring condition are necessary, not because the information was new, but because the pattern needed to be witnessed again before the next instance arrived. Awan settled into the archive chair, adjusted the holographic display angle, a small calibration she performed before every session, automatic, logged in her access record for 61 years, and opened the first sealed file. The Vejhari hegemony. Their story was the oldest of the three, dating from approximately 40 years after humanity's first contact with galactic civilization. The file was thick. The Vejhari had been thorough record keepers, which meant that their certainty was well documented, which meant their failure was well documented too. Their initial assessment of humanity ran to 14 pages. The conclusion was a single line: species designation human, military capacity negligible. Standard conquest protocol recommended. Estimated resistance duration, 72 hours maximum. Awan had read that line many times over the years. 72 hours. She let the footage play. The Vejhari were large beings, beetle-shelled, six-limbed, with a military tradition dating back 11,000 years. Their war fleet at the time of first contact had been capable by their own assessment of cracking moons. The footage showed their ships approaching humanity's home system from the outer belt, enormous, dark, moving with the slow certainty of things that had never needed to hurry. Below them, human ships moved. They were small. They were fast. And for the first 6 hours, they died quickly, in the way that small, fast things die when they encounter overwhelming firepower. Then something changed. Awan had watched this footage many times and she still could not pinpoint the exact moment. It was not a single event. It was a shift in the aggregate behavior of the human fleet, a change in the angle of attack runs, a sudden clustering around debris fields, a pattern of engagement that suggested the humans were no longer fighting in the way they had been trained to fight. They were fighting in the way they had just learned, in real time, based on the last 6 hours of being killed by the Vejhari's specific weapons firing in the Vejhari's specific patterns. An intercepted human communication appeared in the file, timestamped 12 hours into the engagement, translated from an ancient Earth language. A voice, crackling, tired, precise, pattern analysis complete. Their weapons need 47 seconds to recharge. Their ships turn slowly to port. Adjust all attack runs accordingly. Pass it on. Awan paused the footage. That was the moment. Not the moment the humans had started winning. That came later. That was the moment the humans had stopped losing in the way the Vejhari expected them to lose, and started losing differently, which was the first step toward not losing at all. She let the footage continue. By the 18th hour, human ships were carrying weapons that hadn't existed at the start of the battle, jury-rigged assemblies. Vejhari energy components wired into human frames, firing in angles that Vejhari shielding had never been calibrated to handle, because the Vejhari had designed their shields to stop Vejhari weapons, not their own technology repurposed by an enemy mid-engagement. A small detail in the file caught her eye, as it always did. One of the jury-rigged weapon systems, successfully deployed by a human vessel in Hour 19, had been designed by a crew member who, according to the personnel record, had listed her primary occupation as musician. By the 24th hour, the Vejhari were requesting reinforcements. By the 72nd hour, the hour they had projected would see human resistance at 0. The Vejhari home fleet was being recalled from the outer system. The footage jumped forward, 6 months, then a year, Then the final transmission from the Vejhari High Command, which Awan knew by memory but let play anyway. Human forces. This is the hegemony's central authority. We request terms. And the response, immediate, calm, in that particular register that Awan had come to recognize across three separate historical events as the human default voice for exactly this moment. Terms accepted. Civilian populations will not be harmed. Military forces will be disarmed. You have our word that your species will survive this. They had kept it. The Vejhari still existed. Agricultural worlds mostly. Quiet. The records suggested they were, by most measurable indices, content, which was its own strange thing to sit with, that the species which had projected 72 hours to human defeat had ended up, 2 centuries later, growing grain on peaceful worlds under human protection, and that this outcome was the merciful one. Awan closed the Vejhari file and opened the second. The pattern held. Second species, different name, different biology, same confidence, same opening assessment, primitive, negligible, standard protocol. Same 6-week trajectory from absolute certainty to retreat to surrender. This one had lasted 8 months. They had possessed hive mind coordination, which they had believed was an insurmountable tactical advantage. They had not accounted for the possibility that a species capable of independently redesigning their own fleet doctrine mid-battle might not need coordination in the centralized sense at all. The third file was the shortest. For months, the species in question had arrived with a weapon system they believed was unique in the galaxy, a directed gravity pulse that no known shielding could stop. They had been correct that no known shielding could stop it. They had been incorrect in their assumption that this made them safe, rather than simply interesting. Awan set the files aside. There were more. She knew fragments, partial records, entries in an older filing system that predated her tenure by centuries. But these 3 were the ones that the Council's Historical Committee had verified and sealed under the classification that the current galactic order reserved for information, deemed too destabilizing for general access. The sealed files showed something that Awan found, every time she reviewed it, quietly remarkable. In the decade preceding the Vejhari conflict, humanity's exploration vessels had been attacked by 4 separate species in 4 separate incidents across the outer reaches of galactic space. None of those species appeared in current galactic records, not because they had been destroyed, because they had agreed afterward never to be found. 4 species, in a decade, before humanity had even made formal contact with the Galactic Council, and not one of them had left a military report. The chip on the table was warm. Awan did not look at it. She did not need to. She knew what it contained in the general sense. It was the oldest entry in the Vault's restricted access catalog, older than the filing system, older than the current version of the Council. She had read the catalog entry. She had not opened the file. Some of her predecessors had, apparently. None of them had written about it. She had decided years ago that this was probably information enough. On the other side of the galaxy, Fleet Admiral Saren Nall read the Vokai ultimatum twice. She was aboard Solar Defense Station KL-9, a mid-system installation that from the outside resembled a particularly unremarkable orbital relay, a design choice that was not accidental. The station's primary function was officially listed in galactic databases as communications routing. This was accurate in the way that describing a surgeon's primary tool as a very sharp knife is accurate. Nall set the document down on the console in front of her. She had a particular habit, observed by her staff across 20 years, of reading important documents with complete stillness, and then setting them down with the same care one uses for something fragile, not because they were fragile, but because the care was itself a kind of decision. Lieutenant Commander Vesh, her executive officer, had been on her staff for 7 years, and had learned to read that specific moment of setting down the way a barometer reads pressure. Vesh straightened without being told. Nal looked at the document for another 3 seconds. Then she looked at the burn scar on her left forearm, not at Vesh, not at the display wall, at the scar. It ran from her wrist to the midpoint of her forearm, faded to near white, the kind of old damage that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape of a person. She had never had it treated. Her personnel file listed the injury date. It listed no cause because she had not listed one and no one had pushed. Then she looked at Vesh. Activate the quiet protocols. Vesh had been briefed on the quiet protocols during her first week on KL9. She had read the documentation. She had filed the appropriate acknowledgement forms. She had assumed, in the private part of her mind where assumptions lived, that they were the kind of contingency plan that existed for completeness rather than use, the military equivalent of an emergency exit in a building that had never had a fire. She activated them. Across the Varith system, things that had been sleeping for a very long time began to wake up. The orbital platforms came online first. Not with any fanfare, that would have been tactically unsound and aesthetically wrong, Awan thought later, for this particular story. They powered up the way old machinery powers up when it has been maintained but not used. A low vibration first, felt before it was heard, then a steady build through frequencies that the station's sensors registered, and the humans themselves probably felt in their back teeth. The platforms had been positioned at their current orbital coordinates 18 years ago, during a routine debris management installation that no galactic observer had found interesting enough to monitor closely. There were 47 of them. Their listed function was collision avoidance. Their actual function was something else entirely, and the distinction between the two was, it turned out, mostly a matter of what you aimed them at. The lunar installations were next. Awan learned this later from the intercept record. The Volkai Advanced Scout Fleet, positioned at the system's outer edge, had begun reporting energy anomalies within 6 hours of the quiet protocols activating. Their reports were detailed, professionally written, and completely accurate. Sovereign Drevath Koran had received them on his flagship and had filed them under primitive thermal discharge. This was not, Awan noted in her record, an unreasonable conclusion given the information available at the time. It was the kind of mistake that was only visible in retrospect, from outside the pattern. He had made this mistake before, in the sense that the pattern had been made before, not by Koran personally, by the 3 species in her files and the 4 in the older records, and possibly others that no one had written down. It had never been a mistake before. That was the precise thought that Awan wrote into her session record when she read the intercept. It had never been a mistake before. She underlined before and moved on. The mining vessels of the asteroid belt received their orders 22 hours after the quiet protocols activated. Kale Sunta was 34 years old, 3rd-generation asteroid cracker, calluses on both hands from 15 years of running extraction rigs in the belt's inner region. He read the retrofit orders twice, not because they were unclear, but because his brain needed a moment to reclassify what he was looking at. Then he laughed once. It was a short sound, surprised more than amused, the laugh of someone who has just understood a joke that was told years ago and has only now arrived at the punchline. He forwarded the orders to his crew without comment. They read them. Several of them laughed the same laugh. Then they got to work, because asteroid crackers are, above all else, practical people, and the schematics made sense in the particular way that things make sense when you have spent your career applying extreme force to objects that don't want to be moved. By the time the Volkai Advanced Fleet reported a second anomaly, this one significantly larger than the first, the belt was already reconfiguring. Koran's intelligence team filed the second report under escalating primitive thermal discharge. Awan found, years later, that she could not quite bring herself to mark this as an error. The available data genuinely supported the conclusion. The problem was not the analysis. The problem was the axiom underneath the analysis, the assumption that primitive was a stable category, that a species could be assessed at one moment in time, and that assessment would hold. Humanity had been primitive. 250 years ago, by galactic standards, they had been extraordinarily primitive. And in that time, they had done something that no entry in the Volkai military database accounted for. They had noticed the galaxy noticing them, and they had prepared. 28 hours after the quiet protocols activated, the deep cartography fleet came home. Awan had not seen this footage when it happened. She had been in the vaults. She accessed the sensor record 3 days later, and she watched it several times because it was the kind of thing that benefited from repetition. 200 ships dropped into the Varith system from hyperspace in a coordinated formation. The coordination itself was not remarkable. It was technically sophisticated, but the Volkai fleet was capable of similar precision. What was remarkable was what the sensor sweeps found when they tried to classify the arriving vessels. They were human ships. That much was clear from their hull geometry, from certain identifiable components, from the communication signatures they were broadcasting. But the weapons arrays attached to those hulls were not in any database that the Volkai intelligence system had access to. 34% of them returned zero matches, not close match, or possible analog, but a complete absence of correspondence with any known technology. 22% returned partial matches to civilizations listed as extinct, which raised its own category of questions. Fleet Intelligence Officer Draven ran his analysis 4 times. After the 4th run, he set his tablet on the console very carefully, in the specific way that someone sets something down when they are trying not to drop it. He said, quietly, to no one in particular, "These are not human weapons." No one on the bridge corrected him. That was, Alan thought, its own kind of answer. What Draven had identified without fully understanding was the product of 50 years of deep space exploration. 50 years during which humanity's cartography fleet had pushed into regions of the galaxy that the current galactic order had classified as too remote, too hostile, or too strange to warrant investigation. In those regions, they had found things. Old things. Ruins of civilizations that had risen and collapsed millions of years before the current council's founding, leaving behind technologies that no living species had the context to understand. They had traded for some of it, with species so far from the galactic core that no catalog contained their names. They had developed some of it themselves, in the long dark between stars, because necessity is a reliable engineer. And some of it, a smaller portion, but present, they had taken from hostile species that had attacked their exploration vessels and had not afterward found it strategically useful to publicize what happened next. The deep cartography fleet had been gone for 8 years. They had come home ready. 36 hours after the quiet protocols activated, Sovereign Dreveth Koran transmitted his formal ultimatum to humanity. He did it with full ceremony, which meant the transmission included the Dominion's official seal, a statement of his titles in full, a recitation of his 51 conquests by category, and a closing passage about the rights of superior civilizations to guide lesser ones toward productive purpose. It was, by Volkai standards, a measured and dignified communication. It was the 52nd time the Dominion had sent a transmission like it. The previous 51 had produced, within 48 hours, a formal surrender document. The response came 11 seconds later. 11 seconds was fast. Fast enough that the Volkai communications officer initially flagged it as a system echo, some kind of relay glitch, because no government sent a considered response to a formal ultimatum in 11 seconds. Then she checked the source. It was originating from Solar Defense Station KL-9, authenticated, encrypted with a human military cipher that her system resolved in 3 seconds, and then flagged with a notation she had never seen before. Cipher complexity. No degradation expected within current projection window. She forwarded it to the bridge. Koran read it. 4 sentences. No titles, No formal seal, no recitation of accomplishments, just 4 sentences in the register of someone describing the weather outside a window they have already looked out of this morning. Sovereign Koran, you have entered the Varith system with hostile intent. You have one opportunity to reverse course. I want you to know that I am genuinely hoping you take it. The Volkai bridge was quiet for a moment. Then Koran set the message down, and Awan, reading the intercept record much later, in the vaults, noticed that he set it down the same way Nal set documents down. Carefully, not because it was fragile. Full fleet advance, Koran said. All systems to combat readiness. 39 hours after the quiet protocols activated, Koran's tactical analysis team completed their assessment of the human fleet arrayed against them in the Varith system. The numbers they brought to the Sovereign were, on their surface, not alarming. The human fleet was numerically smaller than the Volkai force. The Dominion held the advantage in raw ship count, in established military doctrine, in a chain of command that had been refined over 6 centuries of engagements. These were real advantages. Koran's experience told him they were decisive advantages. The tactical team's report, however, contained a notation in its second section that Koran read twice. Unable to identify human fleet command structure, all attempts to locate flagship equivalent have returned null results. Analysis suggests distributed command authority. No central node detected. Koran looked at his fleet intelligence officer. Every military force has a command structure, he said. Find it. 20 minutes later, the report came back unchanged. It was not that the command structure was hidden. It was that the human fleet appeared to operate without one in the conventional sense. Every vessel was responding independently, making tactical decisions without apparent reference to a central authority, and yet their movements showed coordination, not the tight, synchronized coordination of a hierarchical force, but something looser and, in its way, more resilient. Like a school of fish that has no leader but moves as one body because every fish knows the rules. Volkai military doctrine, 6 centuries old and never seriously challenged, had no counter-protocol for this. The doctrine assumed a head. Cut off the head, the body stops. It was the foundational principle of every engagement the Dominion had ever fought, and it had worked 51 times for the simple reason that every other species the Dominion had encountered had, in fact, built their military around a head. Humanity had spent 200 years designing a military with no head to cut off. Every captain was authorized to act on mission parameters without upward approval. Every crew knew the objective. Every ship could lose its fleet admiral and continue operating without a pause, because there was no fleet admiral. There was only a shared understanding of what the mission was, distributed so completely through the force that removing any individual piece changed nothing about the whole. Awan, reading this section of the intercept record, noted in her archive that this was the moment she had marked in her blueprint as the point where the engagement's outcome became, practically speaking, determined. Not the moment the weapons fired. Not the moment the first ship went gray. The moment Koran's tactical team returned a second report identical to the first, and Koran's face, she had the video, went through an expression she had seen on 2 other sovereign faces in historical footage. In species now filing under the category Menot, had almost put the Volkai declaration in. The expression was, the first awareness that the model is wrong. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then Koran's face closed, and he ordered full fleet deployment, and the expression did not return. Not until the bridge. Not until the display was still on, and everything else had gone dark. Find me the command vessel. Koran said it again, not louder. The same volume, the same register, but with a quality that his bridge crew had learned to read across years of service. The second time meant he understood the first answer and was rejecting it on principle.